Well, good afternoon, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to be part of the Shanghai Forum. It's a privilege to be here. And what I have to say this afternoon actually fits very well with the direction of the discussion that we had before coffee, and particularly the questions at the end about, which began to think a little bit about the social life of citizens in the city and the state of mental health. Before I start, I'll just say 2 words about my own background. I was born in 1949, a long time ago, in a little village just outside London, 30 miles from London. And at that time there were just 15 houses in the village that I was in, and my father actually had to bring electricity to that village so that we had electricity in my village in 1949. So in my lifetime, 30 miles from London, there was no electricity in the village that I was born into. And it just gives you an idea of how things have changed rapidly in other countries too, not just in China. So this is what I'm going to talk about, these 7 items, and I will return to this slide as we go through the talk.
Can you talk to the mic?
Closer? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Why does urbanization matter? You know this data very clearly. China has now surpassed 50% urbanization. In the UK, we reached this in 1850. Surprisingly, we were more than 50% urban in 1850, many, many years ago. And it's now the rate of urbanization across the whole world, on average, is now exceeded 50%. So the future of humanity is in the city. What happens in the city is of profound importance to all of us when we look towards the future. Now, the city has generated in the past very significant social and health problems. As I said, in the UK we reached 50% in 1850, and this is a very famous book by Frederick Engels, published in 1844, just around the time when the UK became 50%, which exposed the kinds of social conditions there were in early city environments. Life expectancy was not much over 30 at this time. So city living was incredibly bad for people's health. It was a very unfortunate period when a lot of people lost their lives because of this kind of experience. Now, most 19th century urban growth was caused by growth in the overall population. What happened in the UK was because the population itself grew rapidly, with consequent overcrowding and poverty. But more recent growth in China and Asia in general has been caused by very large-scale rural to urban migration and the rise of the so-called mega city. And this pattern has generated its own particular mix of health problems, as we will see. And you can see from this slide that most of the top 10, or many of the top 10 mega cities in the world are indeed from Asia, and that's the subject of the overall Shanghai Forum at this time. Although it's interesting to note that while we might think they will forever continue to expand, that Tokyo is likely to have contracted slightly by 2030, although most of the other cities will have expanded further. Well, if we compare urbanization rates in Europe and Asia and Africa, we can see that the shape of the curve indicates both the relatively high rate of change in Asia, here, compared with Europe and Africa. Although Africa is probably due to, it's on the takeoff phase for the future. And there's been a maturation of urbanization in Europe, so that the angle of this slope is beginning to flatten off, and it may well be that in Europe, because many European countries are now reaching 80 or 90% urbanization, of course they have more or less completely urbanized. And we can just see this data again. You're probably familiar with a lot of this data. For China, we see the crossover point in around now, more or less, where the urban takes over from the rural. Whoops, excuse me. Here, that's where the crossover point is taking off. But if you look at the rate of change of China compared with other parts of Asia and Eastern Asia, that China has indeed been urbanizing at a faster rate than other parts of Asia. China is really quite an exceptional case for the rapidity with which urbanization has taken place. So, urbanization matters because in China and indeed in Shanghai, because it has happened so fast and because the future of the human race is in the urban environment. So what happens in the urban environment is of profound significance for us and our health. I now want to ask the question which is not often asked in this context, and indeed amongst health professionals, about mental health. You will notice in the discussions that we have just heard about healthy cities that mental health almost was never discussed at all. And I want to raise that as a question for consideration today. Mental health matters because it's a non-communicable disease, an NCD. And this kind of pattern of disease, the move from infectious to non-infectious diseases, has now taken place throughout the world. And in fact, NCDs, non-communicable disease, is a rapidly growing share of overall world health problems, measured in terms of loss of healthy years of the population, or DALYs as we call them, disability adjusted life years. Indeed, if we look at the causes of death, even in poorer countries, non-communicable causes are moving towards the 50% total. So if we, towards 2030, even low-income countries are moving towards 52%, and low and middle-income countries are crossing it, or have already crossed it, including China about now, so that the world average is moving towards 3/4, and in high-income countries, approaching 90% of DALYs, disability adjusted life years, causes of death in a country like the UK are caused by non-communicable diseases. This is a really, really important point, because much of our healthcare and health concerns are actually addressed at that little bit of 5% of communicable diseases, and a lot of this is missing from these discussions. Again, if we compare blocks of country and the rate of change between the move towards non-communicable diseases, Asia is moving quite fast in terms of the rate of change of moving from communicable to non-communicable diseases. So again, like urbanization, the rate of change is rapid in Asia. Now this is the most important slide I'm going to show you, probably. This is a recent paper that came out about 2 months ago in The Lancet by Rifat Aytun, is a professor at Harvard Business School. Graham Thornycroft is a professor in my own institution, King's College in London, and Vigo is their researcher. And they were looking at the proportion of non-communicable diseases which are attributable to mental health. So if I just go back, so of this area here, what proportion of these are mental health and what are physical health in non-communicable diseases? And this is the most important part of their analysis. They conclude that 32.4%, a third of years of disability-adjusted life years, or YLDs as we call them, are attributable to mental health issues. So of that 90+% of diseases which are NCDs, for example, in rich countries, a third of those are mental health. And this is very often overlooked. It's much, much bigger. In fact, it's the single cause of NCDs in the world. And this is, this always comes as a great surprise to people. This is calculated on the 2013 WHO Global Disease Burden Survey. It's official data. Mental health is a much bigger component. In fact, it's the biggest component of NCDs. And NCDs are the biggest component of health problems. And it's very, very widely unrecognized, which is the point of my talk today. So my argument is mental health is a very important world problem which is relatively unrecognized. And I want to look at the connection between urbanization, which is the major pattern of change in the living and environmental circumstances of human beings, and also how that's related to mental health. So one of the points just to back that up is that despite mental health being so important, actually the amount of money that we spend on mental health is very small. And I've just picked out here, even in my own country, roughly 10% of the health budget spent on mental health, it's the proportion of the budget spent on mental health in the UK is 10%, which one might regard as far too small given what a third of NCDs are in the mental health area. But if we look at other countries, including China, tiny, very, very small amounts are spent on mental health. So here in China, just 2% of the health budget, 2.2% of the health budget is spent on mental health. And I think that's such a huge difference between the burden of disease and the amount of money that we spend. It's really a very important point. It's not just domestic spending. If we look at development assistance, international development assistance, that's the amount of money that global agencies around the world, global health assistance spend. Almost all of this money is spent on communicable diseases. If you go from infectious diseases down, all of that, and there's been $372 billion spent in the last 15 years worldwide, international health aid. 1% is on NCDs and 0.4% on mental illness. So there's a huge expenditure on areas which are of declining importance. The reason for that is international political mobilization. It's not rational health planning, in my view. In particular, there's been a very big political mobilization about expenditure for AIDS, which of course is a serious infectious disease in sub-Saharan Africa particularly, and does claim a lot of lives. But the relative distribution is what I'm talking about, is quite staggering. So what's the relationship between urbanization and this here? What do we know about urbanization and mental health? I'm sorry, I'm getting this thing totally wrong. Right, this is one of the earliest studies done in Chicago in the 1920s. This was an attempt in a book called The City by Park and Burgess in 1925 to characterize the shape of Chicago, how it was laid out. This is nothing to do with mental health, this is just the shape of Chicago. And what's interesting about this, it's a very old but very, very wide, it's a very influential diagram, is how, in a way, it's quite similar to bits of Shanghai, it seems to me, when I've moved around parts of Shanghai. There's quite clear zoning of different kinds of people living in different parts of the city. And they argued in their famous study of Chicago that migration patterns were and their relationship to employment was one of the chief reasons for this pattern. Now, this pattern gave rise, there was then a subsequent study of Chicago published in 1939, a long time ago, called Mental Disorders in Urban Areas. This is, again, a famous study which demonstrated the way that mental disorder was distributed within Chicago. They argued that schizophrenia, which is the most serious, arguably the most serious mental illness that we have, was concentrated in the center city, that manic depression, or mood disorders as they're now called, were scattered across the city. And they argued that migrants and single people had specific psychoses arising from maladjusted social relations, social isolation, and downward drift into poverty. Particularly, they suggested that migrants have many difficulties of adjustment, and that race and class affect rates of mental illness. The question is this still relevant today? There was a study done about 15 years later which looked at New York in the 1960s, which came up with the same kind of results. And this is from a much more recent summary of data looking at psychosis and place. What's the relationship between psychosis or schizophrenia, which has a worldwide incidence of about 1% of the population? It's a serious disorder. What's its relationship to place? And this was a review of 49 studies since the New York study was done, 49 different studies in the intervening 75 years or so, published again by colleagues of mine at King's in 2008. And they found, they looked at misdiagnosis, selective migration, genetic factors, no relationship, neurodevelopmental factors, no relationship. They looked at a whole range of factors. The factors that counted in terms of understanding the relationship between mental disorder and place, which there is a strong relationship, were all social. These ones here: childhood separation from parents, adult disadvantage, discrimination, ethnic identity, ethnic density, urbanicity, the density of buildings in the urban area. So these were the factors which they found in this review could account for the relationship between mental disorder and urban patterns. It's not to do with, it's fundamentally to do with social relationships in the city, not to do with genetic or other kinds of disorder. So, my next point really is to say, what's the relationship between, how does neuroscience deal with this? Because that's how we deal with mental disorder nowadays. You have a very famous Shanghai mental health center in Shanghai. My own college has the biggest institute of mental health research in the world, I think, in London, the Institute of Psychiatry. And neuroscientists have been looking at this problem. And there's a very famous paper that came out in Nature in 2011 by Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg. He's the most preeminent neuroscientist in Europe. He's editor-in-chief of the European Journal of Psychopharmacology, and he shows neuropsychopharmacology. And to quote from him, cities have both health risks and benefits, but mental health is negatively affected. Mood, anxiety disorders are more prevalent in city dwellers, and the incidence of schizophrenia is strongly increased in people born and raised in cities. And in fact, there was a new paper that came out just 2 weeks ago, another review of other studies in the literature, which suggests that the risk of schizophrenia, of having a psychosis, is elevated by 200% for people living in cities. Meyer-Lindenberg's widely cited study shows that urban living leads to increased amygdala and perigenual anterior cingulate cortex activation, affecting social stress processing. In other words, city upbringing or living is stressful and damages our mental health. That was his argument. And a series of recent studies in the neuroscience literature, and I've just given you some examples of headlines here, have started to ring the alarm bells between urban-generated stress and rates of mental disorder. And this is a particularly interesting quote It's time for sociologists and biologists to bury the hatchet and cooperate to study the effects of environmental stress on how people behave. Stress in the city and its impact on mental disorder is now very high on the neuroscience agenda. What's interesting, though, is that we have to ask, what do we mean by the social? If the neuroscientists are asking sociologists to help them to analyze the social relationships of the city, what do we mean by the social? Well, if we look at what neuroscientists say, and I'll just read out one or two of these. They talk about urban upbringing and habitation, noise, crime, slums, people jostling, poor and poorly coping mothers, economic hardship, sexual or physical abuse, and so on and so forth. There are many of this is just picked out, and these are all quite recent papers in the last 3 or 4 years. And neuroscientists are actually mentioning a number of social factors without measuring them at all. They are throwing them into conclusions from papers or introductions to papers, saying, we cannot explain this, we need to look at social factors, and then they're just mentioning things that they can think of. The point is that we don't know really which particular social factors are responsible for varying rates of mental disorder in urban environments. Some of these have been looked at, true, by epidemiologists, but the characterization of social relations and the social experience of cities by epidemiologists is very thin. They usually measure fairly simple things like social class, or numbers of friends, or postal district, but they don't really look at the lived experience of being in the city. There are, however, policy and clinical concerns, and I just show this out of interest for London. This is a recent poster put up by the National Health Service in London, the Mental Health Strategic Clinical Network for London, and they point out that London has a greater burden of mental ill health and the highest rate of compulsory psychiatric admissions in England. So London, our most urbanised and concentrated centre of urbanicity in the UK, is suffering from very high rates of mental disorder, as you would perhaps expect from what I've just said. So the question I raise in terms of thinking, particularly in relation to the last 2 or 3 speakers, is where does mental health figure in the healthy city idea? It should figure quite centrally. It's a problem for urbanisation, but it's not really being given research credibility. So turning briefly to Shanghai, and I'm moving towards the end of my time. Shanghai has a very high rate of urbanisation. Okay. Shanghai has a very high rate of urbanisation. As we know, it's in a world of its own. It's probably the premier city in the world for the rapidity with which it has grown. We know from the early studies from Chicago and New York that migration appears to be one of the factors, and the social experience of being a migrant in a city may be something to do with mental disorders. So what's the rate of disorder in Shanghai? Well, actually, surprisingly, it's lower than you would expect, which rather counts against my argument, but I'll come back to that. So that in Europe, roughly a quarter of people have experienced a mental disorder, a diagnosable mental disorder of some sort. This is a very widely cited figure and accepted. In Australia and America, these are probably to do with different diagnostic perceptions. But the WHO puts the figure for mental disorder in Shanghai down at about 1%, which is very odd. And this is also a well-known, relatively new study of an epidemiological study around the regions around Shanghai, which puts the rate at 17%, which is a bit close to this. There's actually been a very long dispute between these two sources of information about who is right. The point I'm making here, I'm not a clinician, I'm a sociologist, is that we don't know exactly how prevalent mental disorder is in Shanghai. It's being measured in different kinds of ways, and it's not being given the kind of serious attention which it needs, in my view. So, one of the things some of you here know very well, several of you know very well, is we have funding now to have a look at this problem for Shanghai, and we've had a generous grant allocated by the British Economic and Social Research Council and the National Science Funding Council for China through a new program of combined funding to look at these 5 questions for Shanghai. So we're in the process of just building up on this project led jointly between the UK and in China to have a look at patterns of mental disorder in Shanghai, what do we know from the published data, and then to focus down on the issue of migrants. That's what we can't, in terms of a new study, we're planning to look in a qualitative and very ethnographic way of the social experience of living in Shanghai of migrant workers. To have a look at the development of services. There's been a new national mental health law in China about 2 years ago. It's being implemented locally or not. There are local rules for implementing these services in Shanghai. I don't know how much they're really being developed. And we want to find out, if we can, from Shanghai, if there is undiagnosed mental disorder here, and if in fact there's a relationship between the lived experience of being in Shanghai and your mental health status. We want to find out about that so that we can share it with other cities around the world, because as we saw right at the beginning, mega cities have grown very rapidly. So, just briefly to finish, what are the lessons for Asian cities? The Shanghai Forum is about Asia, not just about China. I've just chosen a couple of slides to illustrate what we're talking about in the UK. The UK government recently had a major series of reports commissioned on the future of cities. There were 31 different reports, and this diagram comes out of one of those, or was used by one of those reports, to give you an idea, and something that the Healthy Cities idea also believes, which is to move people right to the centre of health planning in the city, and to work out from. This is actually based on an earlier and well-known diagram which we saw earlier on today. In particular, they've adopted these 5 principles, and this is my last slide, which I would commend to people in Asia thinking about city planning. And these 5 principles were developed by the British Royal Chartered Institute for Landscape Architects, 5 principles for healthy places. And the ones I've highlighted in red are particularly relate to the social life of the city, social relationships. The first one obviously is to do with keeping the water and the air clean, and that's really what the Healthy Cities that we heard earlier is all about principle 1, but they don't seem to cover the other 5 principles. This is what's missing, the ones in red, really, from the Healthy Cities movement. It's to do with how we live in cities, and I think there should be a lot more sociological attention paid to these factors and the social life of cities than there has been in the past. Thank you very much.